It's easy to establish pathways from North Africa to another North African nation like the ancient Egyptians. What is surprising is how long some of these cultural things held on. And the most obvious way of finding this out is looking at it through the linguistic channels, noticing that specific words would contain and continue for thousands of years from the dawn of ancient Egypt and the break of the Berber civilization till today. How is it that some words have been maintained in almost their pure state, allowing us to break open the seas like Moses and walk straight through the lies and get to the truth of how everything happened? It's almost as if it was protected by some kind of god or gods. So, what we have in front of us are four different types of Afro-Asiatics. The first one being the Semitic branch, the second one being the Abyssinian branch, then the Egyptian branch, and then the Berber branch. It's not always obvious that we should start with the difficult or the easy, the top or the bottom. But in this case, let's just start from the top. So, the word Ali, as in Muhammad Ali, is a very familiar word to us. But we don't know exactly where this word came from. All we know is that it means exalted or, divine of some kind. But really, what it means is ascended, high, peak, zenith, top. And this word is actually consistent within the languages of Afro-Asiatic, which doesn't always happen, but in this case, it did. For example, the word climb in the Berber languages, whether it's Tamashek or Tamazig or any of the others, is Ali. And you can see that it's a version of the word, which means to rise, to climb, or to go up. In Hebrew, there's the word Allah, which means rising. And you can see that, of course, within the Semitic branch, there is Ali, Allah, and Ali. And all of these come from the same place. And of course, there's derived words, which means words that come from these specific breaks. Of course, this is just a feature of these languages. But now, this version of the word in Hebrew is pronounced Alu rather than Ali. But you can see again, same thing, it means going up. And of course, this word has always been connected religiously, as this word here in Hebrew, which I will not be able to pronounce, Allah Ligrel, means to make pilgrimage. Then there's this version of the word, Har, meaning mountain. Now, you notice how diversely the word is being used in Hebrew. This is true for the Berber version, and it's also true for the ancient Egyptian version. Of course, we can't leave out Arabic because, that's probably where it's, most known from. This word, the way you say it is Ali, which is probably closer to Aeli than Ali. So not Ali, but Aili. Another famous word that comes from this derivation is Aliyah. Aliyah means to ascend. Now, the ancient Egyptian version of this word is very complicated because, first of all, it's mainly pronounced Yar instead of Ali or any of that stuff. And secondly, it's connected to so many words that it's hard to even know which words don't have it and do have it. For example, the word nature are, meaning great God or the eldest God, comes from this. So nature R, and the R part is the Ali part. Now we already know that a lot of these words would have had an L in them. We just don't know which ones exactly, because we can see from Coptic that we get the word Oli, Ale, Ole, and all of these words, which practically mean rise, ascend, expand, all these words that mean the exact same thing. But going back straight to Egypt, we can see that the word itself is used in so many different parts that it switches just like most Afroasiatic words do, and other words from other African languages, but let's stick to Afroasiatic, that when you try to get the word down, you start to realize that it's used mainly as a prefix and a suffix. And in order to get into detail with that, we would need an entire video. Now, the languages within the Abyssinians that actually have this word, like Eli and all these other words, they don't really matter because they're Semitic in origin for the most part. So we'll leave that one out for now, knowing that they do have some connections to this word. So what are the ancient Egyptian words that are related to this? Well, all of them are basically pronounced Ila or Iya in that way, and they're meaning a place, to expand, to go through, to lift, to rise. I already told you, to become great, to become expanded. It even means, in some cases, foreigner, which is interesting. Now, let's move on to the flames. The fire is one of the most important things in history. And so, obviously, this word would have been said over and over again. Now, the word Bur means to light up, or to turn on a light, or to set a flame. And this word was used all over the Afroasiatic regions, to the point where there's really no point of starting at one point to another to another. They just all used it. The ancient Egyptian version has a G at the end, it's Berg, but all of the rest it's Bur. And in the Semitic branch, it's used more as a affix. Let me quickly get this out the way. The word burn does not come from the word burr. The word English word burn comes from brew and brennen and bry and other words like that mean to burn. But in the R, the one in English and Indo-European languages, starts with BR usually. It's just that in English it became BUR. So the R flipped to the other side, but it has nothing to do with these ones. Now, why is this word important, Burr? Well, it's because it has something to do with, obviously, if you're going to use the word fire and light, you're going to have a whole bunch of expanded words from around. For example, the word for last night in the Somali languages, in the Abyssinian languages, is Bur. But the word for lightning in in Jidden, basically, one of the Afroasiatic languages, is Bur. And you will see this a lot of the time where words that are only slightly connected will have the etymology, it will have the core word in there. The color yellow and green in some Afroasiatic languages is interchangeable, which is strange because usually the word color green and blue are interchangeable in most languages, but yellow and green is actually very strange. Now, we know that in ancient Egyptian, the word for green was wahaj, but in the Berber language, it's awrak. And in other languages, in the Semitic, it's warak. In the Cushitic versions and the Abyssinian versions, it's also a version of this, like wara and warak. But again, a simple connection which isn't consistent with all the colors. That's the one thing that is strange. You would think that every single color would still be consistent to this day, but it's actually not, which confuses me because why change them over the years and keep so little? Now, obviously, the research done on the Semitic branch of Afroasiatic languages has been done way more. And so, even this word warak, we know way more about the Semitic version of it. We, first of all, know that the word means green, and the word green refers to leaves because leaves are green. So, if see a full expansion from the word green, meaning warak, to paper, meaning warak, and then we see that expansion go on to paper money, meaning warak. So from the color green to the word for money, it's warak. Now we could continue down these lines forever and ever, trying to find the connections between these different locations. And I've done a few videos like this, but usually I left the Berber out because I think too many people were not very reflective on the fact that when I say Berber, I'm talking about a specific type of people that are native to Africa. And even if we include other people, the languages are still connected to the ancient Egyptians. And so there is no reason to ignore this connection. And so when I show you stuff made by Berbers and I show you the connection between them and the ancient Egyptians, remember that it's not a linear one. It's not one where the people from Egypt have a slight connection with the people from Berber and might have been borrowed or might have been. We're talking about some old connection, prehistoric. Now, again, if we try to separate, okay, so here we're sitting there, we're trying to separate. How does one language group come to hold at least, let's say, the core regions from North Africa, East Africa, Southeast Africa, and Central Africa and West Africa? How does it hold from there to the Semitic areas? How does it get from there to there? It must have been a very large spoken language. It must have probably been the biggest language of Africa at the time, as opposed to what people keep saying where they say it's not even African. It seems like not only was it an African language, but it was probably the biggest language in Africa. And this is probably why we find it everywhere. Whereas, for example, the Bantu language, we don't find real evidence for it outside of the Bantu regions. The Niger languages, we don't really find evidence for it outside of the Niger regions. Even the Sudanic languages, we don't outside of the Nile, it's very hard to come by. But the Afroasiatic language is scattered throughout Africa. And this simple connection shows us, you know, something that confuses me is when you look at Ethiopians and you look at black Berbers and you look at, black North Africans, people look like twins. They almost look like they come from the same exact place. But you can tell, of course, that there has been a very minimal amount of mixture. But their history is so far apart, yet they're connected by so much. There's that question of, which came first, the chicken or the egg? What did come first? Did the Ethiopians come first, or did the Berbers come first? What we do know, though, is of course there were other groups within these regions that make it very, very difficult for us to figure out exactly who the people are. Now, the good thing is the other people that were in Ethiopia are the Nubians, or the Nilotic speaking people. So we know that it's easy to tease out that language, because you just go and if it's not Afro-Asiatic inspired, the word, then it's probably, if it's native, going to be inspired by a Nilo-Saharan language. But if it's not inspired by a Nilo-Saharan language, then it must be a more modern connection between that word and a Semitic language, which makes it very easy to tease out. The problem with the Berber is that they're surrounded by many people and they belong to so many people. Remember, the Berber belong to North Africa, Central Africa, Southeastern Africa, and Chad. These are four very different locations. Not to mention, of course, they belong to the Afro-Asiatics. But Chad's languages are so different than that of the Berbers that not all Chadic people are Berbers, even though most Chadic people speak an Afro-Asiatic language. But not all people from the Berber regions speak anything close to the Chadic version of Afro-Asiatic, regardless of their race. And I tried to use here Tamashek, for example, and try to use the languages that are today still considered closer to the black version of it, but it doesn't help. The languages still seem to be very, very far apart. Now, of course, there's that still a connection with West Africa, because the people who are in North Africa, for example, the groups that I've talked about, they have a direct connection with the Niger populations. In fact, they fell right under the empires of those people. So how are we going to separate it? How are we going to choose what language to choose between this, and this? And the confused, they might think, oh, this is a small problem. The problem with this is they're helping us understand how to pronounce the words in ancient Egyptian. So if we want to expand until we finally understand how the ancient Egyptians spoke, we're going to have to take all of these regions into consideration and remember that we can't play games. So we can't say the ancient Egyptians spoke a Niger language. They did not. But let's take the word Ali, for example. So if we look at the ancient Egyptian one, we don't see an L in the middle. And these guys write consonances all the time, but we don't see an L in the middle. We know that the word means the same as the other words. It means to rise, expand, blah blah blah. But it would be closer to something like I or are we or something like that. But this is how we know that it's probably a very silent L, because if we look at all the other Afro-Asiatic languages, they have this silent L there. I mean, they have a strong L, but because of that history, we know that there's a silent L. Because why? Well, like I showed you, there was some where the L was replaced, and it was I, and it was IE, and stuff like that. And of course, you look at Eli, that's a different version. Uh, that tells us that these are clues that break down the puzzle slowly. These are clues that break down the puzzle. How do you get to this place where you finally unravel? We do not need a time machine yet. There's no point of giving up. We can look at the words one by one. Now remember, this is the worst part. Remember, ancient Egypt was never isolated. And so they did pick up a lot of words from a lot of people on the outside. The ancient Egyptians did not have camels until 500 BC. Now, this is a little late compared to everybody else, but they did use a certain type of camel by 500 BC, and the word they gave to it was Gemer, which probably came from the Semitic root. And there's something important about this that needs to be talked about, which is the connection between the two lands, the Asian and the African lands, which is different types of camels. I mean, the one that we're used to, and I'll show you, is really the Somali Abyssinian region camel. But the one that we see being used very early in other regions, like the Sumerian version, they're very, very different. You will see, it's very, very different. And so you can see that when the Abyssinians, or whatever you want to call them, let's call them Ethiopians, tamed this animal, it became standard. Now, like I said, the ancient Egyptians had no concept of the camel, which, you know, things like this to me, like I said, evidence of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but things like this to me show me that the connection between the two groups wasn't as between the Asian groups and the African groups wasn't as strong as people like to pretend they are, as even though the camel existed and from Africa, and the taming of the African camel and the utilization, giving the utilization to the Asians, even though it spread through the Egypt, it was not done until 500 BC, which tells you that, again, a stronger connection between East Africa and the Middle East in that sense, showing you that there was this exportation done in real life outside of Africa. Now, of course, Egypt is more connected to places like Nubia and stuff like that, and even they, didn't use camels as much as the other regions in Africa did, and when they did use them, they went crazy. Now, the Sumerians had a type of camel, but it looked something more like this. This is called the Bactrian camel, and as you can see, it's not exactly the camel that most people think about when they, use camels today. This one was used by the Sumerians, but also used by the Chinese and the Mongolians, as we have seen in history. Now, the Sumerians, as early as anybody else, did use the camels. Now, remember, I said in Egypt it was 500 BC. Well, in other places, for example, in Africa, it was about 2000 BC. That's 1,500 years before the Egyptians would start using camels, even though most people think of camels, you know, simultaneously with Egypt and North Africa in general. In Southeast Asia, camels were also used about 2000 BC, especially the dromedaries. The dromedaries are the camels that we're used to, the ones that were discovered by the Africans and spread throughout the regions. Now, I told you that this camel is a minority. Well, how little of a minority is it? Well, this camel is about 6%. Then there's other camels, which are in the 4%. And then 90% are dromedaries. Now, whether domestic or not, camels can be found in cave art from Lascaux in Ethiopia from 9,000 years back. And in Chad, we can find wild camels going back at least 5,000 years. Now, I want you to keep these numbers in your head because they're very important for determining where the dromedaries were first used. Okay, so I showed you that the people, even though they used camels in Sumeria, most of them were Bactrian camels. Well, let's do run the numbers. Well, in North Africa, including some of the Berber regions in the very north, it was still close to about 500 BC when the camels would be used. In Chad, it was 2000 BC. In Ethiopia, it was about 3000 BC. In Asia, it was about 2000 BC. Now, I don't want to make it sound like, oh, it was because of stupidity or anything like that. No. Remember, there was a competing animal called the horse, and the horse was being used all over North Africa, and we see many versions of this. Firstly, I want to show you that this is a Berber depiction. So these are people from the Berber regions riding camels, and as you can see, they are very comfortable with them now. But remember, they used to ride horse and cart. In fact, even the Garamantes, we know from writings that they were more horse and cart type people rather than camel people, but they had a lot of camels. Don't get me wrong. And again, the Berbers then would adopt to the camel life. And even, I don't know, but even to this day, you would probably more associate, Berbers with real Berbers with, you know, cattle, goats, and stuff like that than with camels. But the camels are used for transportation by these people a lot. But like I said, it's a recent thing that came to them. So, what does this have to do with words in ancient Egypt? Well, it really goes to my point of being able to tease out words that existed in the past. Because, there's some words where I was certain they came from ancient Egypt. But then if you just dig a little deeper, you will see that ancient Egypt never had anything close to that. And then the word will disappear just like that. By the way, I want you to look at the double skirt that girl's wearing. That is very similar to that Bantu skirt that I've always shown. I'm not exactly done with the camels yet, but it's interesting for us to see this right here, this similarity between these three nations. Berber, representing rock art, Venda woman, and a Sundanese, a Dongala. Now, I don't want to leave out India. This isn't a depiction of India. This is Sumeria, but I don't want to leave out India in the equation. Of course, India had a bunch of camels, and it still has a bunch of camels. It's one of the big places that have camels. So I'm just going to add that in there so no one says, hey, what about India or whatever. And remember, the Americas also have camels. So, yeah. Still, my favorite image is this Bedouins riding far and rushing far away with camels.